Sputnik International reports Poland preparing political pretext to occupy Western Ukraine. Warsaw is planning to establish a regular Polish-Ukrainian union for subsequent occupation of Western Ukraine and announce its intention to build, quote, the strongest army, end quote, in Europe. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said this earlier today. Well, that's a bit aggressive. So the Sputnik story continues. Poland has become the main instrument of the U.S. anti-Russian policy and declares its intention to build the most powerful army in Europe for this purpose. Warsaw has started large-scale arms purchases from the U.S., the U.K., and South Korea. Sergei Shoigu said this at a meeting of the board of the Russian Defense Ministry. Brian, based on some of the things that I've been reading and hearing of late, I don't think that that Sergei Shoigu was being rhetorical here. And your thoughts on his assessment, and if Poland is planning to become the main instrument of the U.S. anti-Russian policy, I might suggest that they call Ukraine and ask how that's working out for them, because I don't think that that's going too well for Ukraine. Brian Berletic.
That's a really good point. And I think we've seen for many months now the U.S. positioning Poland as the next proxy in line for Washington to use to wage proxy war against Russia with. And we hear about this massive military buildup that Poland is undertaking. They're doing this at the expense of resources that could be better invested in Poland for the Polish people. This is a military buildup that is going to take many years to be completed. And even when it is completed, even though it would technically have the largest military in Europe, so did Ukraine at the beginning of the Russian special military operation. Just as you said, it went very poorly for Ukraine. It will go very poorly for Poland. Now, one last thing I want to add is that the way the United States and Turkey cooperated to create a buffer zone in Syria as their proxy war there was failing, to freeze the conflict in place seems very similar to what we see happening right now with Poland and Ukraine. This could be a way we see that the offensive is doing very poorly. There really is no plan after that. This could be one of the ideas they're exploring to freeze the conflict at the very least.
And elaborate on that. What I understand you to be saying is, since Russia is so sensitive to troops in Ukraine, well, NATO then is saying we won't put the troops in Ukraine, we'll put the troops in Poland. And I use troops. I use troops very liberally. Forces, the force.
Yes. Well, I'm not so sure that they would hesitate to send troops over the border. They would send them someplace in Ukraine where Russian forces aren't, just like they did in Syria. And they would create essentially a buffer zone. And that would give what's left of Ukraine's military some sort of safe haven to operate in, or perhaps even if this is a union idea between Poland and what's left of Ukraine, maybe the border would, for all intents and purposes, be erased, and they would be able to take safe haven into what was exclusively Polish territory. So I think we have to keep a very, very close eye on this. I've always suspected that there was this desire to create some sort of buffer zone inside Ukraine to save whatever is left of Ukraine. So that
the Western Ukraine, that's what the Western Ukraine discussion is. That's the buffer zone, not Poland. Now I get your point. And from what you understand, and if I remember last week, we were discussing when this Western Ukraine issue came up, and Poland was the one bringing it up. If I remember President Putin's response, his response was basically, well, if that's what y'all want to do in Western Ukraine, if you want to basically secede that to Poland, fine, just don't mess with Belarus and everything will be okay.
Yeah, there's a possibility that Russia will find that acceptable as long as they're able to meet all their other objectives elsewhere in Ukraine.
So antiwar.com has a piece from Politico. Ukraine declares war on Russian shipping in the Black Sea. An advisor to Zelensky told Politico that everything the Russians are moving on the Black Sea are valid military targets. This is from Oleg Yustenko, an economic advisor to President Zelensky. That to me sounds like a pretty bad deal. What say you, Brian Perletic?
Yes, I think it does create a security dilemma for Russia in the Black Sea, but I don't think that it's as serious as I think Ukraine would wish it could be. They're reacting to their own ports, their own infrastructure along the coasts being destroyed by Russian strikes. This follows not only the unraveling of the grain deal, but also the strikes on the Crimean Bridge, strikes elsewhere in Crimea. And so what Ukraine is attempting to do is respond to this, but they're doing it in a way that will not have any impact at all strategically on Russia's war efforts. So it's another example of Ukraine doing something more for optics than any actual tactical or strategic gain on the battlefield.
In fact, my next question to you was going to be, was this really more rhetorical than military? And is it also as rhetoric in terms of trying to win the war of public opinion? Was this really, again, more rhetorical than actual? But again, when you start selling those kind of wolf tickets and the opposition is the Russian military, I still don't think that's a very smart thing to say.
No, it's not. And they are carrying out real attacks on Russian shipping and Russian military vessels. And all this is going to do is give Russia more incentive to further destroy whatever infrastructure Ukraine is using to launch these attacks.
There's another story, Brian. U.S.-made cluster munitions fuel Ukrainian counteroffensive. Bombs are destroying Russian trenches and artillery systems in an area where Kiev's troops had struggled to advance. Your thoughts on this? And, of course, I don't have any direct insight into what's happening on the battlefield, but this just sounds a lot more like rah-rah and cheering from the sidelines. And I don't know how much these types of stories actually reflect reality.
Absolutely. That's exactly it. I mean, they're talking about an area on the battlefield where Kiev's troops struggle to advance. And as far as anyone knows, they're still struggling to advance there. The use of cluster munitions wasn't going to help in any shape, form, or way break a deadlock that existed before these munitions showed up. These are actually less effective when targeting defensive positions. The only thing these cluster munitions do for Ukraine is allow them to continue firing artillery a little bit longer. So the offensive has dragged on much longer than expected with no results at all. This allows Ukraine to put some more time up on the clock to try to make something happen here. And when you read the actual article, they give you a few anecdotal stories about positions that Ukraine has taken. But this has been going on throughout the entire conflict. Sometimes Ukraine takes a Russian position, sometimes Russia takes a Ukrainian position. The real determining factor is who is taking more positions from whom and who is losing more troops. And the answer is very clearly Ukraine. Ukraine is losing more troops, and that is the whole point.
I'll just read a few pieces here. Newly delivered American-made cluster munitions have given fresh impetus to Ukraine's campaign to retake territory captured by Russia after weeks of little progress. While the cluster bombs alone won't tilt the battlefield balance of power decisively in Ukraine's favor, soldiers say they have helped them retake Russian positions that they had struggled to reach. One of the other elements of this, in my many conversations with Mark Sleboda, is that Russia has been engaged in kind of advanced strategic withdrawal, that they're being very, very strategic in where they place their troops, how they place their troops, how long their troops remain in place. And so to say that these cluster munitions are resulting in some type of helping Ukraine retake positions, it might just be the fact that Russia decided to move troops back first for other strategic reasons.
That's absolutely right. This is all about the nature of the fighting itself. This is all still happening in the security zone, or what some people are calling the gray zone, this space between the front defensive lines of both Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine has not made it to the first Russian defensive lines, of which there are several. They are layered. So 2 months now going into the third month, they still have not made any actual progress. And so this really is just another story about another wonder weapon that is supposedly helping the Ukrainians turn the tide, even though in the article they do eventually admit that it's not actually going to turn the tide. But that is the whole tone of this article and many others that are coming out, a way to try to spin what is clearly at least a stalled offensive, if not entirely a failed offensive.
And how much of this, if any of it, is really directed towards the American members of Congress, as there's starting to be more conversation, more questions about this ongoing funding for this fool's errand? Tommy Tuberville, someone who, an incredibly conservative Republican who I never thought would take a position like this, just came out yesterday and said, this is basically the junior varsity fighting a college team. And now there's also discussion about revisiting the issue of should there be an inspector general overseeing the spending that Joe Biden just keeps pouring down this rabbit hole. So how much of this do you think is for domestic consumption?
It's hard to tell. And also what I've noticed recently in the Western media, side-by-side articles like this are articles that are just outright admitting that the offensive has so far failed. Ukraine is suffering catastrophic losses of both men and equipment, that they were not receiving the equipment they actually needed. They had no air power. All of these things we were told ahead of the offensive that you and I knew were going to be a failure. All of these things are now admittedly, okay, they may have been very bad ideas, but there was no way it was ever going to work. And that's why we see what we're seeing on the battlefield now. So I think it's a very confused information space at the moment in the West, because you're getting a little bit of everything. You still have some people pushing this narrative that the offensive is viable, and others who are admitting very clearly it isn't.